You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 332, The Society of the Cincinnati. Last week we covered the final breakup of the Continental Army in 1783. During that final year, the officers and men not only suffered terrible deprivation, but also came to understand that promises made during the war involving pay, pensions, land grants, and other benefits might not be kept. The men were also looking for a way to maintain the bonds that they had created during the war. In the spring of 1783, many of the officers formed the Society of the Cincinnati. The society is named after the Roman leader Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus. According to his legend, Cincinnatus was a farmer who left his farm to accept an appointment as the leader of Rome during a war. After victory in battle and restoring peace, Cincinnatus restored power to the Senate and returned to his farm. This personified the ideal of the civilians who had taken up service during the war, but were expected to return to civilian life and make sure all political power remained with the civilian government when the war ended. The inspiration for the society is largely credited to General Henry Knox. While the Army was killing time in West Point, waiting for the war to come to an end, Knox proposed the establishment of a society that would allow the officers to continue to associate with one another after the war. Knox had apparently been thinking about such an organization for some time, as had other officers. News of the peace treaty, which reached the Army in April, probably made the plan a priority if they were going to put anything into place before the Army disbanded. The first organizational meeting took place on May 10th at the Temple of Virtue. This was the same building that the Continental Army had built as a meeting hall only a few months earlier, and where General Washington gave his famous Newburgh Address only a few weeks prior. General Friedrich von Steuben presided as the senior officer at the meeting for the formation of the society. At the meeting, the officers present voted for Steuben, General Knox, Knox's aide-de-camp, Major General Samuel Shaw, and General Jedediah Huntington to form a committee to put together a formal resolution about the society that they could circulate to the rest of the Army. 3 days later, the officers met at Steuben's headquarters, and the committee formally adopted the resolution, thus creating the society on May 13th. The society established itself with 3 basic goals in mind. 1, to protect the rights that they had secured during the war. 2, to promote the continuation of a union between the states. And 3, to assist members in need, as well as their widows and orphans. Membership would be limited to officers who were still serving at the war's end or who had served at least 3 years during the war in the Continental Army or Navy. It was not open to enlisted men. It was not open to officers who had only served in state armies or militia. The society did permit certain high-ranking officers in the French Army and Navy to join the society as well. Officers who had died during the war were granted membership, and their membership would be inherited by their eldest son. Going forward, only the oldest son of any member of the society could inherit a membership. A society would be set up in each state, with states given the authority to subdivide into districts within their state. Each state society would meet annually and would set its own rules. They would have the power to expel any member who acted dishonorably or against the interests of the community. There would also be a national or general meeting every 3 years that all of the states would attend. The General Society would elect officers and also establish a fund for operations. There was also a provision for honorary memberships to men who had proved eminent in their abilities and patriotism in some way other than service as a Continental officer. Honorary memberships could not be inherited and were limited to 1/4 of the total membership. Each officer agreed to donate 1 month's pay to their state society so that the society could establish a fund and use the interest of that fund to cover any operating costs. Anyone was also free to make donations to the state society or the national one. Now, since none of the officers had actually been paid, they could pay the sign-up fee by directing the paymaster general to direct 1 month's worth of pay to the society once the Army was ready to make those payments. They also established a badge to identify members, a gold medal on a blue ribbon with a white edging. The medal would depict Cincinnatus receiving his powers on one side and returning to his farm on the other side. This was later amended so that there would be an eagle hanging on the ribbon with the images of Cincinnatus appearing on the chest and back of the eagle. The officers made an effort to get as many of their fellow officers to join as quickly as possible, spreading the word of the society to all regiments to establish a society in each state. And they had to work quickly. The society only really began recruitment after its organizational meeting on May 13th. On June 1st, Washington announced that most of the Army would be going home on furlough. As the Army was breaking up, the popular idea of the society spread through the officers. A committee consisting of Generals Heath, von Steuben, and Knox met with General George Washington to request that he lead the society. Washington agreed. As second in command of the Army, General Heath reached out to armies still in place in other parts of the country to inform them of the new society. General Alexander McDougall was elected Treasurer General, and Henry Knox as Secretary General. The establishment of the society nationwide grew pretty quickly. By November, there were state committees set up in all 13 states. The group prepared to hold its first general meeting of all state delegations in May 1784. Almost all top officers who were eligible for membership in the society did in fact join it. Among the founding members were George Washington, the Marquis de Lafayette, John Paul Jones, Alexander Hamilton, and Aaron Burr, Generals Anthony Wayne, Arthur Sinclair, Nathaniel Greene, Henry Knox, Benjamin Lincoln, Daniel Morgan, Lachlan McIntosh, Baron von Steuben, and Horatio Gates. By the 1784 national meeting, about half of the 5,500 former Continental officers who were eligible for membership had in fact joined and paid their membership fee. Almost from the beginning, though, the society had its critics. General Heath, who had participated in the establishment of the society, expressed some concerns about it. Many of the comparisons to knightly orders in Europe made it seem un-American and perhaps contrary to Republican values. Colonel Timothy Pickering, who was the Army's quartermaster general, also expressed concerns about the elitist nature of the society. Now, despite their reluctance, both of these men did join the society. There had never been a veterans organization before in America, certainly not one at the national level. The only historical reference people had were European orders, where leading warriors formed orders of knighthood after serving together in battle. These orders were seen as the basis of nobility and aristocracy. After all, aristocrats were descended primarily from military leaders of the past who had performed some valuable service for the king. Many of the features of the Society of the Cincinnati shared features with these European knightly orders. The creation of such a group in America seemed to many to threaten the ideals of an equal citizenry without separate classes defined by accident of birth. Aristocratic orders controlled Europe and were seen as a tool to keep the commoners down. That was antithetical to the goals of the Revolution. For many Americans who had not served, the society looked like it would become the tool of a counter-revolution that would undermine and eventually end the universal freedoms for which they had all fought and sacrificed. By the fall of 1783, a larger civilian population was learning about the society and expressing its concerns. A town meeting in Connecticut feared that the organization would be used to lobby on behalf of veterans' benefits, which would mean they would have to pay higher taxes to support them. General Arthur Sinclair wrote that he actually delayed forming a Pennsylvania chapter for fear that just creating it would have a negative impact on ongoing state considerations for passing veterans' benefits. In October, South Carolina Judge Adonias Burke published a pamphlet called Considerations on the Society or Order of the Cincinnati. Burke expressed concerns that a hereditary organization of military leaders was the establishment of a class of nobles that threatened the idea of a democratic republic. This permanent organization of military leaders and their descendants would threaten the idea of a government established by and for all the people. It would establish an aristocratic class. Burke's pamphlet, which was originally targeted simply for South Carolina politics, was soon republished all across the continent. Elbridge Gerry, a delegate to the Continental Congress from Massachusetts, wrote numerous letters to other leaders saying that he believed the society would become an instrument of tyranny. Others, including John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay, were all highly critical of what Franklin called the, quote, hereditary knights of America. Public editorials and articles attacked the society. One accused it of establishing a parallel power structure that was independent of elected government and one that would soon dominate the political system. In February, the Massachusetts legislature began an inquiry to consider measures against any plans to, quote, promote undue distinction among the citizens of this free state and tending to establish an hereditary nobility. A month later, the committee report condemned the society. South Carolina Governor Benjamin Girard expressed similar concerns, telling a joint session of the legislature that, if left unchecked, the society would endanger the success of the revolution. The wave of criticism over the Society of the Cincinnati seemed to take some officers by surprise. George Washington, who certainly kept up with the editorials and pamphlets on this topic, began to worry about his own reputation. He had agreed to lead the society, thinking it was an appropriate way for the officers to maintain the fraternal bonds that they had established during their time in the Army through this private organization. He certainly did not want to be seen as leading an organization that threatened the results of the revolution. Washington wrote privately to many men whose opinions he valued, including Thomas Jefferson. In response, Jefferson told him that popular opinion believed that the society was unconstitutional and subversive of the ideals of equality and liberty in the young republic. He thought it should be abolished and recommended that Washington separate himself from it. Personally, Washington was torn. He was concerned about his reputation as a stalwart in favor of republicanism. He did not want to be seen as a threat to that, even though he was not convinced the society represented any such threat. Beyond that, Washington did not want to resign, because that might be seen as a betrayal to his fellow officers. Washington remained leader of the society, and he traveled to Philadelphia to attend the first general meeting in May 1784. At that meeting, Washington proposed a series of radical changes. He called for the removal of anything political in its writings. The society should be seen as a fraternal organization. Its involvement in politics, or even potential involvement, was a big source of criticism. He also said it should discontinue the idea of hereditary memberships. The hereditary nature of the society led to the comparisons to hereditary aristocracies in Europe. There was no need for that. The society should also stop admitting honorary members. Allowing powerful political figures to join the organization only heightened fears that it was becoming some sort of shadow government outside of elected government. The society should also reject donations from non-citizens. Fears that outside interests might try to gain influence in America through such donations had been another expressed concern. Any funds raised to assist veterans in need should be put in the hands of the state legislature for dissemination. The creation of some sort of private pension system could be seen as a way to maintain influence through the use of that money. Washington also called for an end to the general meeting. As I said, the original plans called for the various state organizations to meet at a national event every 3 years called the General Meeting, this being the first one. These national meetings made the organization appear to be more powerful and would probably only end up sowing dissension between the various state organizations. The General Meeting began on May 4th at City Tavern in Philadelphia. On the second day, Washington presented the above recommendations on reform to the entire group of those meeting. The men who were there were reluctant to make these changes. but Washington suggested that he might resign if the changes were not made. So they met in committee for about a week before presenting their response. The members adopted some of the reforms, but seemed to want to water them down. Again, Washington pressed the issue, not wanting to be a part of a group that would be seen as controversial and a potential threat to the principles of the revolution. By the end of the 2-week meeting, the Assembly adopted Washington's reforms and sent them to the state committees. Since the men at this meeting were the leaders of the state committees, one would have thought that would have been the end of it. As Washington had hoped, his reforms did seem to mute the national criticism of the society. However, most of the state committees ended up not adopting the reforms. The leaders didn't want to make the changes and only agreed to carry them back to the state committees out of deference to Washington. In the end, the society ended up continuing much as it had originally been established. Now, some states agreed not to accept foreign donations. Originally, the members expected to wear their medals at all times. This changed so that they were only worn on special occasions. Overall, though, the controversial features such as hereditary memberships, national meetings, and private funds largely continued with all the state societies. The failure to enact these reforms only invited more attacks on the society. Some states considered adding a prohibition that members of the society would be ineligible to run for public office. In 1785, John Adams announced that he was considering retiring from public life because he believed the society threatened to transform the republic into an aristocracy, thus destroying everything that he had worked for. That same year, the French Count de Mirabeau published a revised version of Burke's critical pamphlet, including new criticisms by Benjamin Franklin and others. It reaffirmed the idea that the Cincinnati were attempting to transform America into some sort of hereditary aristocracy. Thomas Jefferson publicly joined the argument a year later, writing that the society posed a threat to the political stability of the United States. Some critics believe that the society was actually part of a French plot to spread its influence in America. By this time, the society had a chapter of French officers who met in France. The King of France permitted these officers to wear the Order of the Society of the Cincinnati on their French uniforms. Although France had been a close ally of America during the war, many American leaders were still wary of French influence on America and the dangers of a monarchical government's influence on the new republic. The Cincinnati were accused of being a tool of that influence. Burke, whose pamphlet had been the first very public criticism, continued to rail against the Cincinnati. He argued that the attempt to establish itself as a fraternal and charitable organization was simply a front. Its secret hidden purpose was the establishment of a noble order that would rule over America. As a hereditary peerage, it would slowly and secretly destroy the democratic reforms of the Revolution and establish a class of nobles who would become quite separate from the commoners who made up the bulk of the population. The Confederation Congress, which contained members opposed to the society as well as some society members, refused to recognize the society in any way. In a 1785 land ordinance that made land available in the Ohio Territory, an initial draft prohibited bearers of hereditary titles from residing in Ohio. Now, this prohibition was dropped before the final version passed, but it did show that even Congress had grave concerns about a potential threat. The controversy remained strong enough in 1787 that when it came time to hold the second triennial meeting in Philadelphia, Washington sent his regrets. Always trying to avoid controversy or insulting either side, Washington used vague excuses of his health and personal finances for not attending. He remained an officer in the State Society and as the titular president of the General Meeting, but at the same time, he seemed to want to distance himself from his association with it. As consideration of government reforms came out, particularly consideration of the new Constitution in 1787, many critics accused the Society of the Cincinnati of being a conspiratorial force that planned to use such reforms to take over the new country. It was only after the actual establishment of the new Constitution that many of these fears of the Cincinnati creating a new aristocracy in America finally began to fade. Next week, we're going to take a look at the state of slavery in America at the end of the war. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, and Michael Mulhern. Thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Kurt Avard, Greg Pusak, and 10 Crucial Days. Thanks also to William Greco for a generous one-time gift via PayPal. This week, we looked at the creation and ensuing controversy over the Society of the Cincinnati. Despite his hesitation, George Washington remained the President General of the Society until his death in 1799. After that, Alexander Hamilton took the office. When he died a few years later, the leadership passed to Charles Coatworth Pinckney and then to his brother Thomas Pinckney. The last actual veteran of the Revolutionary War to lead the organization was Aaron Ogden, who served until his death in 1839. The city of Cincinnati, Ohio, was named after the society by General Arthur Sinclair. He was both a leader within the society and also in charge of the territory at the time. A great many veterans and members of the society settled in Ohio, partly in response to land grants that were provided after the war. To the modern audience, many of us probably just shake our heads and wonder about why there was such a big deal about this organization. In hindsight, we're quite comfortable with the range of veterans organizations that have formed after all major wars. The Grand Army of the Republic became an important veterans organization after the Civil War. Veterans of Foreign Wars, also called the VFW, formed after the Spanish-American War, but went on to serve veterans of World War I and World War II. Vietnam Veterans of America served a similar role. For the most part, these organizations were not controversial. They may have done occasionally something that was controversial, but no one saw their existence as a threat to democracy or the American way of life. So why was the experience of the Society of the Cincinnati so different? I think part of it was the fact that people just didn't have any experience with veterans organizations. The only thing they could compare it to was the orders of knights that existed in Europe. Now, the fact that those who led the military in Europe were the aristocrats who exploited the masses in peacetime certainly raised alarm bells for those in America who made that connection. The fact that the society created a hereditary line also contributed to that fear. I should also clarify that members of the society referred to it as a society. Opponents tended to call it an order, making it sound more powerful and nefarious. While the controversy over the society did begin to fade after the adoption of the Constitution, it was probably because the society, which by that time had been around for years, didn't seem to be doing anything that its critics had feared it might. It might also be because opponents of threats to state liberties became much more focused on the threat of Federalists under the Constitution, and that probably took more of their attention. As the generation that fought the Revolutionary War died off, so did much of the society. By the early 19th century, many of the state societies had dissolved, and by the 1850s, total membership was less than 300 men nationwide. Membership was restricted to descendants of veterans who had actually joined the society following the war. In 1854, the society opened itself up to the descendants of anybody who would have been eligible to join based on their wartime service, even if that officer who served did not join. This seemed to give the society a new life, as many descendants who wanted to honor the service of their ancestors began to join. It continued to restrict membership to the eldest son, or if there was no male descendant, the honor of membership could be passed to the nearest male descendant. Over time, the society has changed its mission more to one of keeping memory of the Revolution alive. The society grew again in the early 20th century, establishing the Lars Anderson House in Washington, D.C., which is open today as a museum and library. The society also established the American Revolution Institute, which works to promote understanding of the Revolution and its legacy. In hindsight, we can say that the claims of threats to democracy and threats to the goals of the revolution seemed at best overblown. But even to the modern audience, limiting membership to the laws of primogeniture and limiting membership only to descendants of officers does seem a bit elitist and runs against the American ideal of not having benefits based on ancestry. Now, that said, the Society continues to do great work in keeping alive the memory of this important era and the sacrifices that many men made through their military service. My book recommendation this week is The Society of the Cincinnati, Conspiracy and Distrust in Early America by Marcus Hunemoorder. This gives a good overview of the formation of the Society and the early controversies that followed. The book is not very long. It's under 200 pages, not counting notes and index. It's also admittedly very expensive. It looks like used copies on Amazon are selling for over $100. I suspect it was sold as a school textbook. The author, Hunemoorder, teaches American history at the University of Munich. His book on the Society was published in 2006. So if you're interested, the title once again is The Society of the Cincinnati, Conspiracy and Distrust in Early America. My online recommendation is the Society's website. That's www.societyofthecincinnati.org. They have some great pages about the Society's history, as well as a lot of pages on the Revolutionary War itself. It's a great resource and just very interesting to browse. My question this week comes from Bob Schneider. He asks, I don't get why the states were so reluctant to pay for the soldiers. Didn't they realize their obligation to the soldiers? Were the states and their inhabitants in such bad financial shape? It leaves a very bad taste. It's like the whole revolution was about people who wanted stuff but didn't want to pay for it. Well, Bob, I have stressed the terrible money problems that the Army experienced over the course of the war. And although I try to maintain a certain neutrality, I probably have given off a sense of disapproval about the way that the veterans were being cast aside with almost nothing. I think my discussion of continued deprivations suffered by soldiers and the unwillingness of states to provide funds for the Army leads to your question of why was this the case. Part of it is the timeless issue that no one likes to pay taxes. Yes, the economy was part of it. I've seen estimates that the U.S. economy shrank by about 30% between the beginning of the war and the establishment of the new government under the Constitution. Part of this was so many working men leaving the workforce to fight. Part of it was the destruction and looting of property during the war, and part of it was the loss of British credit and trade. This combination made finances much more difficult for everyone. You also have to remember that in the pre-industrial era, there was just a lot less wealth to go around. Of course, GDP was not something that was measured at the time, but there have been estimates by history economists who understand this far better than I do, and they calculate that the GDP per capita in inflation-adjusted dollars was under $500 when the nation began. Today, it's over $50,000, and as I said, this is adjusting for inflation. Based on this calculation, people were 100 times more productive in generating wealth today than they were 250 years ago. The result was that working back then was far harder for far less reward than we enjoy today. Thus, paying a larger portion of that income as taxes took a much higher toll on the average taxpayer. States were also in difficult shape. What money they did raise was often used to pay for state soldiers and militia, where the state had the primary and undivided duty. The question of paying the Continental Army was a matter of dispute, and so state leaders regularly complained that other states should be paying more of it. States that had enlisted disproportionately large numbers into the Army argued that the other states needed to put up more money to pay for this army that served as a mutual defense. States with fewer enlistees wanted each state to fund their own soldiers. So in some ways, this was a giant game of political chicken. States didn't want to make payments to what they regarded as this international organization because they wanted to convince other states to pay more. There was also a great suspicion against giving Congress authority over direct taxation. The war had been started over the idea that each state should be empowered to tax itself, and no one else should be involved. I mentioned a few episodes back that Rhode Island killed a plan to let Congress impose an import tariff. I really didn't get into the details of why they did that, but the main reason was the state had big war debts of its own. It planned to rely on state import duties to pay off those debts. If the state gave that taxing power to Congress, its own debts would go unpaid and it would be bankrupt. When we look at the relatively generous benefits that we give to our armed service members and veterans today, the relative pittance being fought over back then does seem downright cheap. But the main reasons for this, as I see them, were there was just a lot less money to go around, and the states really were not thinking on a national level and wanted to pressure other states to take on greater portions of this burden. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on Twitter, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.